honest, you guys. I didn't expect to be back so soon. I expected to like pick out another book, do what I usually do, just read it, and then rant about it to friends and family because I've acquired new and disturbing knowledge, which I have to like, you know, get rid of, sort of like pass the horror on to other people, so it's a little bit more manageable for me, so I can go back to reading my horrific shit. Sorry for the language, but it's really. I mean, basically, all I do is read stuff related to the Holocaust. So, mostly, obviously, I also read a lot about Nazi atrocities. So, some real horrible things there. Anyway, so yeah, I thought it was going to be like the normal thing. And I would just like do a nice review or something for you guys. Well, I mean nice as in like it's well written. But no, I'm unsettled. So I'm going to make videos where I analyze or go over basically where I stopped. If you don't like it, I mean, why are you here? Anyway, so as you can see, I only read the prologue and the first chapter, and obviously I have some thoughts. Anyway, this is called The Nazis Next Door. It's by Eric Lichtblau. I don't know, maybe some of you guys have watched the document on Netflix, which is called The Devil Next Door. I personally haven't watched it because I knew that if I watched it, especially since it has multiple episodes in it, the amount of fury that I would feel would consume me. So I haven't watched it. But obviously, if you've watched it, you can recognize this is the guy. I can't remember his name. It'll come up in the book. This is the guy who the documentary was about, the one who was hiding. And I know a little bit about the story of him, and anyway. So, I knew this was going to be a doozy because it's called The Nazis Next Door. I am pretty familiar with Project Paperclip, not like technically familiar. I'm not, a historian or anything, but I mean, obviously it gets mentioned a lot in the stuff that I read, but it's always like a byproduct or like a side thing that doesn't really have to do much with the subject that I'm reading about. So I was like, you know what? I know there were Nazis in the United States. Let's read a little bit about them. So I bought this book. I just like making myself angry. So I didn't even get past the quote page before I became angry. So one of the quotes, there are two quotes on the quote page, and one of them is, standard. It's from Robert H. Jackson, who was a Nuremberg prosecutor. He said, "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." And then the next quote directly underneath that is, "It is all forgotten. It's all over." And that's from Jakob Reimer, former Nazi SS officer living outside New York City in 1998. That was infuriating to me. So if you don't know too much about like the issue with America, I mean, I've probably gone off about this a couple times, but for anyone who isn't my friend watching this, which would be incredible to me, the United States' history is so steeped in fascism that it boggles the mind. Like, for example, you can Google all of this, of course, but all of the books that I read are very highly meticulously researched. I mean, they have like pages and pages of notes, and it's all like material that I then later read. Anyway, for example, actually, you guys might know this, but Hitler is quoted as saying something to the regards of the fact that regarding the Nazis' persecution of the Jews and homosexuals and other groups they considered a detriment to the German bloodline. They said, we learned how to do this from the United States. And honestly, if you look at some of the stuff the United States was doing to black people at this time, and some of the propaganda, and I won't go into it now, but honestly, it's unsurprising. Like, anyway, I mean, we have a massive history of white supremacy, which like goes hand in hand with fascism, and that goes all the way back to basically before the United States was formed. I mean, we were formed on like this idea that the white man was the person who could make laws and other things like that. So like, but what a lot of people don't know is that before the United States entered the war, there was a organization that was formed that was anti-war. It was formed to keep, with the goal of keeping the United States out of the war. So, that sounds great at first, you know. That organization was called America First. I don't know if that sounds familiar to any of you. It should, because it's been coming up a lot, like over the past, 5 years now? Yeah, so it was founded to keep America out of the war. And just because it's mentioned in this book, but it hasn't gone into it very much, I looked it up a little bit so I could give you guys some facts on it. It was a pretty big organization. It had Charles Lindbergh in it, who was, I don't know if you know, but he is definitely anti-Semitic. It also had wonderful people such as Gerald Ford, who, if you don't know about him, and the fact that, like, I think, what was it? No, it was Henry Ford who had the picture of Hitler on his desk, and vice versa. They were like friends. But Gerald Ford was also, part of this. Anyway, they, wanted to keep the United States out of the war. For, a variety of reasons. Obviously, war is bad, but in this case, like, we definitely needed to fight. So, in 1941, for example, just to give you a little taste of what that committee was like, Lindbergh delivered a speech to a rally in Iowa on September 11th, 1941. He said, "It is not difficult to understand why Jewish people desire the overthrow of Nazi Germany. The persecution they suffered in Germany would be sufficient to make bitter enemies of any race. No person with a sense of the dignity of mankind can condone the persecution the Jewish race suffered in Germany. But no person of honesty and vision can look on their pro-war policy here today without seeing the dangers involved in such a policy, both for us and for them. Instead of agitating for war, the Jewish groups in this country should be opposing it in every possible way, for they will be among the first to feel its consequences." Tolerance is a virtue that depends upon peace and strength. History shows that it cannot survive war and devastation. A few far-sighted Jewish people realize this and stand opposed to intervention, but the majority still do not. Their greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. So, basically, I don't know if you guys know what the Protocols of Zion are, but that last sentence where he is saying that the Jews, the American Jews, basically own the press, the cinema, the radio, and also the United States government. It's right in line with the Protocols of Zion, which is a document that was created to make a conspiracy, basically. Well, first it was a play, and then people found it. You can look up the history online. I think it was the Russians. They found it and they turned it into a blame game sort of thing. They replaced who was the main antagonists in it and put the Jews in there. So it was like the Jews want war. The Jews, because the Jews want to control everything, stuff like that. And it was just not true. The Germans also, believed in this and propagated it. Anyway, so as you can tell, that's what America First was based on. America First was based on basically pro-Nazi propaganda in a way. And the Nazis even tried to infiltrate it. I don't know how much they did infiltrate it, or if they did it all, and probably we will never know. But they technically didn't even need to because of this propaganda. Anyway, they decided to disband when America declared war on Germany and Japan, and so that's where they should have stayed in history. But instead, we have them here again in their slogan, "America First," when it was really supposed to be about anti-war and pro-Nazi stuff. Anyway, so that was kind of a tangent, but it's relevant because what I was trying to give an example of was how ingrained this stuff is in American history, to the point that it's if you think that this hasn't affected our politics or our government in any way, especially with such big names. Gerald Ford was one of our presidents, and he was part of this, for example. Henry Ford was the biggest car maker, and he influenced policy and stuff like that with his money. There are way more examples that I'm sure more learned people know than I do. But anyway, the point is, there's no way that it didn't affect our government and our politics to a truly insidious level. And recently that's been coming out, but it was pretty low-key up until recently, or people were able to ignore it, basically. So this, I feel, is important for people to know. So I'm kind of doing this for people who can't get the book, or people who just don't like reading or won't read the book, because I just think it's super important, especially with the rise of neo-fascism, stuff like that, to understand how it has affected the course of our history as Americans, and our government and our policies, and how it still affects us today. Anyway, so moving on. Obviously, we're only doing the first chapter, and I'll just go through the stuff that I found either interesting or horrifying. You're lucky I didn't mark everything that I found horrifying, which was basically the entire first chapter. for example, in the prologue, the author, Lichtblau, basically goes into like the experience, kind of like a spy novel, except like not dramatic and stuff like that. It's actual like history about this guy named Tom Subzakov, who's calling his old CIA handler, freaking out because and this is in, what is it, 1974. He's freaking out because like people are ruining his life with Nazi accusations and it's not true, stuff like that. He was like freaking out and threatening, exposing basically the CIA's involvement with him and the FBI, etc., if he didn't get protection. But when his handler went to try and look at information, because he worked with him for years, like tried to get his files from before 1950, they were mysteriously missing. So anyway, yeah, he's here like trying to say, at first he had tried to write it off as just the vicious gossip of the immigrant community. Hadn't there been similar smears spread by the communists against dozens of other good Americans since the end of the war? Good men, respected men, men like him. These were solid citizens, etc., etc., etc. And he goes on to like refer to who we now know are Nazis, like Werner von Braun, who's one of the most famous ones. But so he says, yeah, like these good upstanding citizens, the German rocket scientists in Alabama, who were also Nazis. So there we go. So I thought that was kind of funny in like a dark, terrible way. Anyway, moving on to the first chapter. So I haven't, in my research, gotten very far in researching the displaced person camps, which I'll refer to as DP camps because that's what they were referred to. Anyway, but they did exist, and as I said in my last video, they existed until as late as November 1957, and I know that because I was actually dealing with records from that point when I was volunteering for, what was it? I think it was a Rolson Archives, their Every Name Counts project, which I totally suggest everyone go and volunteer for. Anyway, so I saw like the DP records, like how when they were finally like disbanded. Anyway, so the DP camps were basically, a lot of them were basically just where the concentration camp prisoners were liberated. So they were liberated and then they were stuck in that same camp. Except instead of the Nazis overseeing them, it was the Allies. And they were basically in the same conditions. And America did this too. But anyway, I'll get into it. This quote I thought was interesting. It's from Jacob, I think it's Bieber or Biber. He survived the Nazi purge in the Ukraine, and he was confined at the American DP camp at Vorenwald. And he said, "We felt like so much surplus junk, human garbage which the governments of the world wished would somehow go away." And that's because, like, nobody wanted to take the Jews after the war. They didn't want to take the Jews during the war. They didn't want to take them afterwards. It was a crazy situation. So while they were confined and not allowed to escape and put in these terrible living conditions, still, the Nazis were able to just scatter, basically. It must have been incredibly frustrating. I can't even imagine. Like, I'm angry. um, so there's regarding that, the chilling irony could be reduced to simple math. Every Nazi who managed to get a golden ticket out of Europe for passage to America meant one fewer displaced person in the Allied camps who would be able to get out. And that's because America, for example, which was just mentioned there, limited the amount of visas that they gave out because they didn't want refugees, and they especially didn't want Jewish refugees. So they were very stingy with handing out visas and to refugees in general, especially the Jews, as I said. And so any visa that a Nazi got from the American government, which they were able to get easier than the Jews, because of their different, because they weren't stateless, basically, meant that a survivor didn't get one. For every Nazi that came to America, someone who survived the camps or the Holocaust or the purges, stuff like that, they didn't get the chance. So it's disgusting, to say the least. Only 40,000 people were admitted to the United States in the first 3 years after the war, despite calls for America to open its shores. Now, this is despicable and disgusting to me, but is it really surprising? I mean, this is how we were back then, and now this is how we are still. We hate refugees in America, which is crazy. We just don't want to help people. We put people in these situations too sometimes, like the DP camps, for example. We could have done stuff about that. We put them in these situations and then we're like, oh, no refugees. We don't want them because they're jobless, because they're like stuck in this situation that we put them in. It's crazy. It's heartless. Yeah. So, thousands of Nazis sneaked in on their own, easily gaming the American immigration system, our lauded immigration system. But hundreds more had help from senior military and intelligence officials at the Pentagon, the CIA, and other agencies who believed that the new immigrants, despite their obvious Nazi ties, or sometimes because of them, could help vanquish the Soviet menace. And to go into that a little bit further, one of the reasons why the persecution of war criminals was so, it became like super lax and was like basically non-existent, is because right after the war we had the Cold War. The Soviets split Berlin, the Berlin Wall and everything, and so the West, like the United States, for example, deemed that the Cold War was more important than prosecuting criminals from the last war, and they thought that maybe even these criminals might be useful because they hated communists. So, and then also because a lot of the courts that these criminals were persecuted in were headed by judges who had been judges during the Nazi era and were still judges us. So that was a bad choice. But anyway, that's the point. A lot of stuff was dropped. For example, industries were allowed to continue and to thrive, who had built their wealth and business off of slave labor. Siemens is one that comes to mind. Yeah, I have a whole thing against Siemens, but I won't go into that right now. That's another book and another time. So, yeah. Like it said, no one hated the Soviets more than the Nazis, officials in Washington liked to say, and they wanted to exploit that enmity. And so here's another quote. as an American prosecutor told a judge decades later when they were actually persecuting a Nazi who had gotten an American visa and gotten into the country, he was never entitled to immigrate to the United States. There were only a limited number of visas back then, and Mr. Reimer took the visa of a real victim. So, yeah. Anyway, so it goes on. I'm basically going in order of the chapter. It goes on to talk about the DP camps in more detail. So one of the problems with the DP camps, as I mentioned earlier, were the conditions. So thousands died from disease and malnourishment even after Hitler's defeat. At Dachau, at Bergen-Belsen, and at dozens of DP camps like them, they remained jailed inside the walls that Hitler had erected. So they were stuck in these camps with basically the conditions that they were liberated in. So I don't know how much Holocaust literature any of you have read, but one of the imageries that sticks with me is the constant description of how bodies didn't even look like bodies, and they were stacked up like cordwood. And if you don't know what cordwood is, it's firewood. So think of a pile of firewood, like how you do firewood, especially if you like bring up a massive, like you get a bunch of firewood because that's how you prefer to heat your home during the winter, and you have this huge stack and it's all stacked and fits and stuff. That's basically what it was like. So they were living in this squalor, this horrible place. Most of them didn't have running water. And they were forced, because they didn't have any other clothes, and some camps didn't have the warehouse like Auschwitz did, which is referred to as Canada, and either way it was probably regulated. So most of them, if not all of them, were forced, since they had no other clothing, to continue to wear the prisoner uniforms that they were liberated in. And if you don't know what that is, it's the you can look it up for the imagery, but it's the striped pajamas. Yeah, so that's what they were forced to wear. And another problem is that in the DP camps, Nazis were also contained in them. So, like, survivors were bunked side by side with Nazis who, they're perpetrators, just not even months earlier. And they were forced to, like, stay in these camps with them, with the people who had done these things to them. And another part, I'll quote here, some Nazi prisoners were even put in charge of Jewish inmates at the Allied camps, ruling over them even in defeat. That's nuts. I can't even imagine that. And that is something that America perpetrated. Like, we are not innocent of that. And it's also conspicuous that a lot of German war prisoners had it a lot better. So while the Holocaust survivors, the camp survivors, were in these camps and they were like begging for food, I'm not even joking about that, just for like even small morsels. Germans watched movies, played soccer, even took college courses. And here, meanwhile, the Holocaust survivors fought merely to get extra rations of soggy black bread and coffee to make up for the starvation of the war years. American officials resisted. They complained that the Jews were getting preferential treatment and were using black market systems at the camps to violate limits on food rations. That's nuts. They were literally starving these people, and just as the Nazis had done, they were like, I think we're feeding them too much, so we're not going to listen to their requests for more. And so, like, finally, eventually, Truman like can't ignore the people who were like, oh, this is despicable, you know. So he sent over someone to check out the situation in the DP camps because he was like, they can't really be that bad. I mean, we're Americans, you know. And the person he sent there was, he did not pull punches. He was like, yeah, they are that bad. Here's a quote that I've seen in a couple of different books. It's kind of famous, I think. As matters now stand, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. So if you've read anything about what it was like in the camps, it was basically exactly like that, except they weren't being gassed or shot. And that, of course, obviously doesn't sit well with me. I know that there's been quotes and stuff, I won't mention specifics, of General Patton's speeches and stuff, used as rhetoric recently. And I've also seen a lot of people being like, you know, Patton wouldn't like agree with that sort of stuff. But Patton was in charge of the DP camps, the American DP camps. He was in charge of how they were run. And he was furious that Truman's, the person he sent over, was like, yeah, they're despicable. So I don't know if you guys know, but Patton was one of the ones who liberated some of the first camps that the Americans saw, and he took this like public stance with Eisenhower of how despicable and disgusting and horrible it was, and he and Eisenhower had like the media flown over to go through it. They paraded German citizens through the camps to force them to see what had been done. Like, he was utterly outraged. But privately, in his diary, he wrote, Harrison and his ilk believe that the displaced person is a human being. Harrison was the one who Truman sent to evaluate the camps, which he is not. And this applies particularly to the Jews who are lower than animals. So this is the man who was in charge of the DP camps, also an American, also a lauded general. I think he went on, he went on to complain of how the Jews in one camp with no sense of human relationships would defecate on the floor and live in filth like lazy locusts. What else could they do? Literally, you provide them, it's basically what the Nazis did, which is you call someone a non-human or classify them as not human, and then you make them not human by taking away all of the things that civilized humanity has now that makes them human. For example, restroom facilities, running water. Like, he was making these people into what he thought of them, if that makes sense, which is also despicable. And then he also goes on, here's another one. We entered the synagogue, which was packed with the greatest stinking mass of humanity I have ever seen. Of course, I have seen them since the beginning and marveled that beings alleged to be made in the form of God can look the way they do or act the way they act. So, honestly, the use of Patton's speeches and how and who it's been used by, I know everyone has not everyone, but people have righteous fury and stuff about it, but he definitely would approve of that usage, unfortunately. So, I mean, Truman was also guilty of it. He wouldn't host Jews in their home, like his wife wouldn't allow it, and the president, Truman, referred to Jews as like racist names when he wasn't in the public eye. Um, so yeah, so that's how the situation was for the Jews in the DP camps. And then we have all of these Nazis flocking out to freedom. So here's another quote from Bieber. General malaise was growing as we realized how indifferent the world was to our tragedy. Soon we began seeing men and women who had survived the worst tragedies imaginable during the war years suddenly killing themselves, often by hanging. Such events added to the news that Palestine remained closed to us, guarded by British soldiers who were turning away DPs by the thousands, only added to our gloom. So, I don't need to say anything else on that, I think. So while that was going on, what the Nazis were doing is they were making themselves into war victims. So they were becoming the victims of the war and getting out and into whatever country they wanted to, instead of the people who were actually the victims of the war. For example, it says the more brazen among them might even pose as anti-Nazis. Otto von Bolschwing had been an influential aide in the Nazi Security Service Jewish Affairs Office before the war, but by 1945 he realized the days of the Third Reich were numbered. By the war's end, he was reworking his biography, claiming to be an opponent of Hitler who had tried to assassinate him. His work was so well regarded that he was able to collect letters of reference from the U.S. Army praising him for the intelligence he provided on his former Nazi partners. And within a few years, the CIA would take him on as a spy of its own, cleanse his Nazi records, and relocate him to America to begin a lucrative career in the export business. So pretty brazen. Just because that was a named example given. I looked him up so you wouldn't have to. I mean, you still can, though. But to let you know what he was guilty of during the war, what exactly our government erased that he did, I looked it up. He was closely associated with Adolf Eichmann, who I talked about in my last review, and was his adjutant, and had some involvement in the planning of the final solution. And he wrote a report suggesting bureaucratic methods regarding the Jews, such as economic restrictions, special taxes, and passport denials to purge Germany of its Jews. And Heinrich Himmler was impressed with it and assigned him to Adolf Eichmann. Over the following years, he wrote dozens of memos and reports on how to persecute Jews. His suggestions to Eichmann included confiscating money from Jews, labeling them on their passports. Oh yeah, he was the one who was put a J on their passports and identification papers so that everyone knows what they are. And allowing Jews to leave Germany but not to return. Rather than advocating the mass murder of Jews, he proposed making their lives so terrifying and unbearable that they would voluntarily leave Germany. And that was, of course, in the early stages of the war, when the ideal was emigration, but they emigrated these Jews to the countries that they eventually occupied, and then they had to deal with them again. And anyway, he was a representative of the SD at the German embassy in Bucharest, where he organized an anti-Jewish pogrom with the Iron Guard in 1941, in which 125 Jews were killed. A pogrom, if you don't know what it is basically a violent action against Jews, meant to get rid of them. And the Iron Guard was a fascist. It was basically like the Nazis of Romania. He was promoted to the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer which is captain, on January 30th, 1941. And after returning to Germany in March, he pursued a career in business and became a partner with an Amsterdam-based bank, which played a role in the confiscation of assets belonging to Jewish citizens in the Nazi-occupied Netherlands. So that is what he did and what we erased. Just so you're aware, he died March 7th, 1982, aged 72, in Carmichael, California. So that's just an example. And it goes on to name another example, of course, like Dmytro Savchuk, or Chuk, got a visa to come to America in 1951 as a refugee and start a new life in the Catskills. He told U.S. immigration officials that he had been a common farmer and woodcutter in Poland during the war. In fact, he had been an armed guard at 3 Nazi concentration camps, lording over prisoners who were forced to burn the corpses of fellow Jews, and he had taken part in a mass murder at a Jewish ghetto in Poland. It would be nearly 4 decades before his lies were revealed. And then Tom Subsakov, the one who's talked about in the story narrative style in the prologue, he was known as the Führer of the North Caucasus. In his official records, he listed himself as an ex-prisoner of war forced into hard labor by the Nazis. Refugee and forced laborer, a relief aide scrawled after interviewing him in 1946, asks for help to emigrate and help him financially, his file noted. So, yeah, they remade themselves into their own victims and took visas from the actual victims. Crazy. So it goes on to talk about how they did that. I know this is getting long. Sorry, I'm not going to limit myself to 30 minutes for every video. Anyway, in the war, the Germans had occupied part of Italy, and after the war, there was still a German majority in some of those areas where most people in those areas spoke German. Italy was a place where it was very easy for Nazis to escape for that reason. It says, even after Hitler's defeat, it was tough to tell who was running some regions. Did we beat the Nazis or not? A headline in Stars and Stripes, the American military newspaper, asked days after the surrender, as uniformed SS officers were still roaming freely and running operations in the Tyrol region. So I don't know you probably know who the SS are. They were Heinrich Himmler's division and enforcers of the final solution, and divisions from them, the Totenkampf, were guards at the concentration camps. So this is nuts. They're, of German war criminals, the SS are a level above the average war criminal. So since they were in control of that region, they were able to get the escaping Nazis out. But here's the kicker. Because they didn't do it alone. You can't really do it alone. It was called the Rat Line, by the way. They did it through the Vatican and the Red Cross, which were complicit in helping fleeing Nazis gain shelter, travel documents, and escape routes from Italy, years of documentation would show. So I looked up a little bit about that, and obviously the Vatican has refused over and over and over again to talk about it, but basically, where is it? For example, Adolf Eichmann used the rat lines. Josef Mengele and Klaus Barbie, that's how they evaded capture. So it says that by comparing lists of wanted war criminals to travel documents from these institutions, Britain and Canada alone inadvertently took in around 8,000 former Waffen SS members in 1947, many on the basis of valid documents issued mistakenly. And of course, again, the Vatican has consistently refused to comment. So one of the ways that they got across through the Red Cross and stuff is they were given like the Red Cross to wear. Honestly, even though this seems to be a mistake by the Red Cross, even though they have done some good in the world, I just don't trust them. I mean, there are some shady things in recent history that they've done, but one of the things that really irks me is that during the war, the president of the International Red Cross, his name was Karl Burkhardt, he was given a lot of information about the concentration camps and stuff. He was even in love with a woman who was in the Ravensbrück camp, which was the women's camp in Germany. And one of the reasons why he didn't publicize or do anything is because he was trying to get buddy to Himmler so that he could get her out. And not only did he not get her out, she still had like garbage treatment, but it was a little bit better than everyone else's. Not because of him, but because she was a Polish aristocrat. So he basically sacrificed so many people for his own self-interest for one person. After the war, she wanted nothing to do with him, which is great. But anyway, he was the president of the International Red Cross, and he would suppress reports about the concentration camps and stuff. And then there was of course, Red Cross branch in Germany, which was, of course, run by Nazis, because everything was run by Nazis then, but it was still considered a legitimate Red Cross, like still associated with the International Red Cross, even though obviously they were Nazis. What do you think sort of help they were giving to anyone in the camps or anything? None. Yeah. So that is that about that. Crazy though, right? So yeah, apparently the United States knew about the rat line the entire time, but so in 1947, 2 years after the war, a secret cable in the Nazis' flight from a State Department official based in Italy called the Vatican the largest single organization involved in the illegal movement of immigrants, and concluded that church leaders had helped former Nazis and former fascists to flee Europe for South America and elsewhere, so long as they are anti-communist and might be persuaded to become Catholics or were Catholics. Crazy that another crazy thing. I keep saying crazy. But the United States, the even bigger thing with the United States knowing about that is that they actually used the rat line to smuggle out fascists to South America to protect them, like former Nazis. So we have a history, like a very large history of helping Nazis. I'll go on. So this is this quote. Just months after Germany's surrender, U.S. Army investigators made a startling discovery. The flight of Nazis to the United States had actually started years earlier, during Hitler's rise to power. 4 gunny sacks retrieved at a paper mill near Munich, filled with German war documents that were destined for shredding, led the investigators to a hidden trove of Nazi Party ID cards that cataloged Hitler's rank-and-file supporters. To the alarm of army officials, nearly 700 of the card-carrying Nazi Party members had left Germany for America beginning in the mid-1930s. Many of them were allowed into the country even after Hitler and the Nazis had invaded Poland in 1939 and set off World War II. So one of the things that is the most alarming about this is that they didn't leave Germany to escape the Nazis. They were like Nazis. They were not forced. They were not fleeing. And that was concluded. They were Nazi Party members who had passed rigorous loyalty oaths, marched with the Nazis, and volunteered their support for the party and its racial ideologies. They were all listed with their names and new addresses in the United States. Banker in New York City, a chemist in Pennsylvania, a musician in Chicago, a pastry chef in New Orleans, a doctor in Oakland, a student in Los Angeles, and obviously 700 more. All of them had taken the Nazi Party oath, and they were now calling themselves Americans and had been calling themselves Americans since before the war started. So what do you think that does when fascists who believe in that sort of thing infiltrate the United States, which has ideologies that coincide in a lot of places, if not directly follow the same principles? It's unfathomable. And this really horrified me. The true total of fugitives may never be known, but the number of post-war immigrants with clear ties to the Nazis likely surpassed 10,000, from concentration camp guards and SS officers to top Third Reich policymakers, leaders of Nazi puppet states, and other Third Reich collaborators. And now we're talking about Operation Paperclip here, because he says some entered openly. Through the front door came more than 1,600 Nazi scientists and doctors who the United States recruited. 1,600. That's crazy. Most people focus on Wernher von Braun, but he was not the only one, obviously. I'll quote off of this. I know what Wernher von Braun did because I read about it, but I'll quote this because it's a little summary. But I'll go here. The U.S. government brought in professionals with direct links to Nazi atrocities and helped some of them cleanse their war records. The fact that a number of them had built rockets on the backs of slave laborers at concentration camp prisoners was of little concern. Whatever moral baggage they brought with them was outweighed, military officials believed, by the promise of technological breakthroughs. And, of course, the most famous was Wernher von Braun. He was a committed Nazi under Hitler. He used slave labor to further his rocket science experiments and stuff like that. He was the he used slave labor in a mountain factory to build the V-2 rockets that bombed London, which he, created. So, we brought that over. We brought the minds of Nazis, their scientists and stuff. How many of them do you think influenced policy when they got us to the moon, which was more important than our moral values as a country, obviously? But these people believed in eugenics. It's no wonder we're having this huge surge. So, and of course, you guys can read up on on Operation Paperclip, but there were Nazi spies, hundreds of them employed by U.S. intelligence agencies in both Europe and the United States. They had been recruited by American intelligence agencies, including the CIA and the FBI, to help get information on the Soviets. Here's the kicker. The intelligence that most of America's Nazi spies peddled to the government usually proved useless or worse, flat out wrong. So they didn't do anything. None of it was worth it. But we still brought them in and made them Americans and had Nazis living among us and affecting so much. But they were anti-communist, so who cares? Ha ha ha. And through the back door, more came in, like Jacob Reimer, who was an SS officer turned potato chip salesman. They called themselves refugees, reformed refugees, and our immigration practices made it super easy for them to do that. Some of the immigration people who were helping them do their paperwork, like, actually coached them on how to fill it out so that they could gain access to the country. Like it says here, a Nazi SS officer who worked at Travniki as he claimed to be a lowly bartender at the concentration camp. He was told, better you don't put that in the papers. So they were coached on how to, like, erase it and come here. So we're getting to the end soon, guys. Sorry. So here we go. So there was a guy, Artakovic, who came to the United States and settled in Los Angeles, working for a construction company that his brother owned. He was here for 40 years. Had anyone dug deeper, it might have been evident that he was a top cabinet minister in the Nazi puppet government in Croatia, or that he had reputedly ordered the murder and imprisonment of some 600,000 of his countrymen. Or also, that he was known as the Butcher of the Balkans. Like, that's a crazy thing. Anyway, apparently a lot of Nazi collaborators came from Eastern Europe. Our immigration policies made it easy for them to come, because while Washington derided would-be Jewish immigrants as lazy and ungodly, Baltic immigrants were seen as hardworking, industrious, and in the racist language of the day, of good stock and good breeding. So basically, America was like, yeah, let's let in Nazis and Nazi collaborators because we think that they're going to be hardworking. As you can tell, I'm, like, angry. Anyway, so this is crazy. And this knowledge of this was known and actively suppressed. Like, for example, the SS had to get a tattoo, like, to when they entered the SS, and it was very obvious. I'm pretty sure it was on their palm. So when they were actually trying to find SS officers and stuff, I think it was only the officers, though, that had the one on the palm. They would say, hold up your palm, so that they could see the tattoo. And so immigration officers were seeing people who were coming through with SS tattoos, and they were, like, warning people. They were like, we saw people get through who were obviously SS, and America was like, shh, 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 shh. So they basically came here and had a wonderful life. They became factory workers in Ohio, janitors in Illinois, car salesmen in New Jersey, life insurance agents in California. They raised children, sending them off to the military or to college. Crazy. Obviously, it's not the children's fault, but it's still nuts. A few muckrackers sounded a clarion call. There are Nazi war criminals living among us. But the gadflies were ignored, or worse, harassed by the FBI and the CIA for prying too deeply into America's dark secret. So anybody who tried to say, oh my God, there are so many Nazis here, the CIA and FBI were like, shut up, don't look, no, let the Nazis be. Crazy. It says, only grudgingly in the late 1970s, more than 3 decades after the war had ended, would the nation begin to wake up to the reality that there were indeed legions of ex-Nazis living freely in America, unburdened by their past sins. And so because of this, a lot of people started raising a stink, and I think there was a congresswoman who picked it up. She was Jewish. So they used that against her when they were like, oh my gosh, this Jewish congresswoman is so interested in this, of course. But people became angry about it. They were like, why do we have Nazis here? And so the government reluctantly was like, oh, I guess we should try and persecute them or get them out. So we go back, we end the chapter, of course, with that quote from the quote page. It is all forgotten, Jakob Reimer, the ex-SS officer in Queens, said when confronted with the details of his Nazi crimes in an American courtroom more than half a century later. It's all over. So, yeah, this has gone on for a while. Thank you to the people who are still here, I guess. But, well, not I guess, but it's crazy. I didn't realize, I knew they had come here and stuff and been facilitated by the U.S. government, but I didn't think it was that much. I really didn't think it was that many. To find out that it was tens of thousands of Nazis and Nazi collaborators, people who literally committed war crimes and atrocities, were just, legions of them were just living here. Some of them are probably still alive. They're people's grandparents and stuff. I mean, if I do have German heritage, but fortunately my grandfather was American, and fought the entire war, he was born in America and fought the entire war, in the American military, thank God. Anyway, but yeah, so if I was in a situation where I didn't know that and have that family history, I would be sweating buckets, because if I had a German relative of any sort after reading this, especially because they didn't talk about their past, I wouldn't want to be related to a Nazi, not at all. And I would be horrified to find out it was sweet old grandmother with her German accent or whatever, But that's just something to think about. Again, I didn't realize it was so pervasive. Obviously, we're going to learn more as I read more, and I'll continue sharing my thoughts unless, I'll probably slap chapters together, but I kind of slapped the prologue and first chapter together, but since this was my first take, it's obviously long. But yeah, and the fact that it was so pervasive, there is absolutely no way that it didn't affect America or Americans at all. For example, Wernher von Braun, he was in Alabama. That was where the space program was. So it wasn't just him in Alabama, it was all of those Nazi rocket scientists working on the space program, and they were all in Alabama, Huntsville, Alabama to be specific. Are you seeing the connection I'm making right now? Because, no offense to any Alabamians watching, but I went to high school in Alabama. I visited there quite often, and you can't say that you guys are the most overall progressive. But maybe it wouldn't have been so bad if they didn't have a bunch of Nazis living in the community to enhance that racism, that fear of having jobs stolen, or like, God, all of the Jim Crow law tropes that still live and breathe. The eugenics that some believe, like, people believe in eugenic science still. It's ridiculous. And maybe it wouldn't have been so many people if America hadn't let all these Nazis in. But who knows? Because that's a philosophical question. Like a mind exercise, basically, because they did let in all those Nazis. So that scenario is a nice dream. It's a nice dream to go through, but it's not the reality that we're dealing with. Anyway, it's very well written, very intriguing, obviously, since I hopped on immediately to start talking about it. And I really suggest you pick up the book if you can't afford to buy it like new. I didn't buy mine new because, books are expensive. So I bought my copy used. I bought it from Wonder Books, but there's also Thrift Books, which is really good. I don't know if it's on Scribd, but yes, I'm going to talk about Scribd a little bit because I'm obsessed with books. Anyway, there's this program called Scribd. It's like an app that you can get on your phone, and they give you 30 days free, and after that it's $9.99 a month, and you get access to like a crazy amount of material. You get books, you get newspapers, magazines, audio books, you get scientific studies and stuff are uploaded on that. It's insane. And I think there are podcasts on it too. But also with your subscription, you get a free subscription to Curiosity Stream. Like, you have that as long as you have Scribd. And I have been watching so many documentaries. But anyway, that's another option. They don't always have like all of the books, but they have a lot. And if they don't have it in book form, they probably have it in audiobook form. If they don't have it at all, just, go to your local used bookstore or go to wonderbooks.com or Thrift Books, and you can find it there. Yeah, that's about all I have to say for the moment.